먼저 가서 기부진다 투모에 남기진 바로 장발라 다 참저스 다 참저데 가르송스네 나 기부 중미게 남기진 배 땜배 가서다 가르스네 니 치와미다 바스 잼바시 아니 데네 아니 신에 가서는 안주에 삼당 안주에 동화 삼다야체 안도신 이제 데네 아니 디삼단에 딜레 아니 만노에 동화 태달레 지tin 딜레 아니 로로네 아니 치마 개와치마 딘르도니 유로게 되지 다디 군론도 조차그로 되지 데네 잠로지 데네 아니 렌제 삼다 렌제 삼다 데네 삼다는 디본기루지 해고레스 디제바이나 기부 중요값서 땡게 투모 남이름바 냠네 집에 가서 땡게 냠네제 조디 디수레스 디수 냠네 제바이나 아니 마송게 두고래 탈제 데르코보 토그레스 이내야 안 디즈미 디그리베선 디고 말에다 덴저고 토바스니 디고 말은 가지고 라다미고 토나야 안 동아여레 동아 타달래 제하고 버리 진짜 띵게 되어 토비어 말에 디네자 디즈미 디고 디마리반자다 같이 오르스네 디냠술레네 네 기부 진다 투모에 남이좀 벌로 장고 고레스 제사데 람리 티비에 가서 있네 기부 중 투모에 남이좀 랍 데네 기부 진다 투모에 남이좀 바장 로장 데네 기부 침벨 남이좀 바 탈둑데 나 산교고 톱고 거래 지난 기부 침벨 남이좀 벌로 장하래 자 냠네 두시레 데자 기부 다데 내가 송하다 다 기부 진다 중원의 투모 남이로 로장 시사바자다 기부 진다 투모에 남이좀 벌로 장고 고레스 당가서 가산 데네 쉬어로 3절이 3절이 되는 시로 당하도 되고.
Good morning. So last night we looked at the transition from the trainings that are shared with the practitioner of initial capacity into the trainings of that are shared with the practitioner of intermediate capacity. So the primary trainings of a practitioner that are shared with a practitioner of initial capacity are the 6, reflecting on the impermanence of this precious human rebirth, reflecting on the intense sufferings of the lower realms. Those 2 reflections lead to the 3rd, the abandonment of the concerns of this life, and rather a concern about one's future lives. That leads to one turning to the 4th training of protecting refuge. And with that as a foundation, one is open and receptive to the teachings on cause and effect. And that cause and effect has the components of both accumulating virtue and turning away from non-virtue and purification. So these then are the 6 primary trainings of a being that are shared with the practitioner of initial capacity. Then, as we saw last night, that one should not be content with that. One should not see the development of a focus on attaining an excellent rebirth in our very next life as sufficient, but rather recognize that even when one attains an excellent rebirth and does not fall to the lower realms, one's position remains precarious in that in every life, as long as one is in samsara, there is the possibility that when death comes, one will fall to the lower realms. Moreover, even though one is in the higher realms, which are far more pleasurable than of course, the suffering realms, one still suffers. One is not at all free from suffering, as we know. Therefore, this recognition then turns us towards the trainings which are shared with the practitioner of intermediate capacity. And as we also saw last night, the trainings that are shared with the practitioners of both initial and intermediate capacity, these are the foundational trainings through which one develops a focused mind and a strength of mind, which is required to eventually become a practitioner of greatest capacity. So this is what we looked at when we move in the transition from the trainings shared with the practitioner of initial capacity to the training shared with the practitioner of intermediate capacity.
나 아주 기부 중인다 투모에 남기린 별로 장와텔라 조 가르치스네다 조 안에 뒤시 동아 캬바 뒤시 동아 데 디 나주다 뭐 최고의 자고래 지자 가상도 들이야 랑신이 대월의 진반 친주 로인배 양다바 대화매라 지로다 가상 타마들라 랑신이 대월의 진바 아니 친주 로인배 양다바 대화매라 시도 지자 랑신이 안은 주기 당은 주기 랑신이 대월 진바 시도 나 주기 풍보디 나 주다 풍보디 나 주기 대화 진고래스 그런 랑신이 대화 세야디 대등한 지단 공어 대화 오늘아 대화 뭐뭐니 바 대화 점고래스 지 삼다디 칠로 친주로래스 진짜 양다바 대화 요 말했어요 오늘랑 뭐니 가소래 뭐이 대화디 말했어 뭐이 저래 랑신이 대화디 말했어 오늘랑 대화 말했어 시고 양다바 말했어
We were also briefly introduced last night to the primary training of a practitioner of intermediate capacity. So if we're looking at the text on page 153, let me see. So here we go. So there was one sentence yesterday where it was, here we go. So even though you attain the state of a God or human being in this manner, so in other words, through the trainings we've already looked at, those that are shared with the practitioner of initial capacity, you do not pass beyond compositional suffering. So this compositional suffering, or the all-pervasive suffering of conditionality, this coming to recognize what this is a primary objective of a practitioner of intermediate capacity. And the text continued. Therefore, it is a mistake to consider that state to be naturally happy. So being born in the high realms and the happiness experienced there, to consider that this is a happiness worthy of striving for is a mistake. It's a mistaken conception. Because, or since, in actuality, it is devoid of happiness. So this is a further primary training of a practitioner of intermediate capacity, to recognize that the happiness that draws us, even the happiness of a good rebirth, the happiness that draws us is not in actuality happiness. Why? Because it will never satisfy us. It's not in its nature something that that leads to lasting happiness. And concluded. And in the end, it is bad because you'll fall to low rebirths again. No, sorry, again, I didn't read that. So just up to devoid of happiness. So this is the second key point that one focuses on in the trainings of being of intermediate capacity, that of coming to recognize that one is, wherever one is born, whatever one's situation, one is subjective to all-pervasive suffering of conditionality, and the happiness that one can experience in cyclic existence. None of it is in its nature happiness. It is not in actuality happiness, because it will pass. It will never satisfy us.
레다 녀모 옹기 중화 아니 유 녀모 바다 안 녀모 레사 내래 중화 규디 레디 그 레다 녀모 중화래 제산다 레다 녀모 옹기 중화자 제 가서 풍보들 라와메 바베지 나초초 데스 마데나 나초초 규어조초초 템보메데지 레더로 바다 아주 풍보들 뭐니 지나 뭐라 풍보코로 뭐 가레스네 유 레다 녀모 옹기 중화 제자디 유야고 메바 대단 녀모와 중화 직체 안당 풍복호는 유대는 주대 풍복호는야 또 말이는 유어주어줘서 나초쇼 아니 지게 강하 체쇼죠 유대는시 풍복지라 배지 네 나자다 말용하게 띵로 차대로 띵로 차대로 안디안 띵부 메바람서 유쇼죠 가초죠 빈르와다 직쇼죠와데 겐지테나 메바 차쇼빈 데네게 류 오스네 옌지테드 류 감보 감자 차로야 나초죠 제가 디네자 가지고 류디 수부티 레다 녀모 옹기 중화 코란 류 코란라 라와 메티게 아니 디네 네 나자 차장이 용사기 땡시된 임바 아니 지게 두시네 교쇼쇼를 차도 여러분 제자디 do something yabu marwa the jujet yabu member chadu or what yabu member chicharu what she then dinis more dinishieter that jidang korongi anzuki the dinichi in that korea dujigi dunga said as more dining as pumbola sometime dinishi more dinishieter yes.
To understand these two key focuses of the practitioner of intermediate capacity takes quite some reflection based on knowledge. So we need to come to recognize that our aggregates, so for example our body, has come about in dependence on karma, and that karma that has led to this ripening result of this body came together with the afflictions. So the afflictions leads to the accumulation of karmic imprints, which ripen in our various experiences, such as this body. So because the karma that has led to, in this illustration, our body, was accumulated under the influence of the afflictions, this karma is contaminated. It is not pure karma, it's contaminated karma. Then the result that follows has this fundamental flaw in it. And therefore, the situation we find ourselves in is unstable. So again, staying with the body, even as you'll all know from your life experience, when you're sitting perhaps here right now in excellent health, feeling strong and vibrant, the reality is, on meeting the slightest of conditions, it can all fall apart. Illness can follow, great pain can follow, and so forth. And this is certainly the case with the body, it's the case in general in our life, that even when things are going well, we have the hope, we have the expectation that it will continue, but it does not. It never can, because the very nature of of our aggregates in general, of this body in particular, is that it is subject to suffering, because it's come about from the ripening of contaminated karma. And part of the recognition here is that we have no free will. We are not in control, despite believing we are. For example, no one wills illness or pain or unhappiness, but yet it arises. We all do our very best to be freed of problems and difficulties, but yet we keep encountering them. So there's a lot here to understand, so as to cultivate the actual there's a lot here to understand which comes about through cultivating the trainings which are shared with the practitioner of intermediate capacity.
Andine zada tangara jugi phungbo de rangxin dewa jinggo re se de dewa jinna de nga kan jinggo ra nga samna wo dewa re jinna de kan jinggo re se de da phungbo de le de ni gi nga zo phungbo gyu da ngo de ni xin ba ji la da phungbo gi jungwa de chanyam ro shi de nga zo ya chowa dunga ga ya ma ge ba cha an de ni shi kabla chanyu de kabla nga zo kar so da nga zo kar so nga dewu in de go ba da nga dewu in de da nga zo le 중화대 류기 중화대 찬염으로 제제 데네갑라 초와 안둥아 가야 맞게 봐자 내가 대부이 나수부 대부이 나 대부이 소 제가 대와 베다 야부를 좀 거다 대와 진시도 아주 대와 세대야지 데네기 류 대와 세대 한 초와 대와 세제 뒤에 멤버제 다들 야부서 내가 아주 딩아 대부이 세대 총안 저기 지소나 나수부 대부이 세대 가장 수수교 수볼이야 내 나정원도 마규에 내가 찬염 유배갑이야 한지 엉아 되고 있는 거로 와 지사데 나는 지금 풍보데 지사데 대화 진도요래 대화 진도요래 지사데 대화 진수데 되니기 교연 가야 교연 매봐 안데 되니기 배 야고라 삼다데 야고래서 비게 진도요래 지사데 심바나신 안 된다데 야고치 레베스는 그때 중앙 찬염도 제배갑을 강한 마트에 마도 there's ko nacho cho the gyun cha cho ko rangi gyu ko rong nyomo ba gyune nyomo ba le le de jo gyu de ne jo are gyu le de gyun ma de ngo le yang ko de chi ma de ko gyun cha cho ji gyun cha cho nacho cho ne na zhe mo yong sa yong cho ro ji ne na zhe yue ba yin yang qi lu ngon du ma yu wa ji nang lo ya ben被这个约定把的对用过的，现在今年上按照上班拿薪，碰不的掉被要不掉起来呗，现在马来时候，但现在按什么了？的变去那这路学呗呢？按这个这用过了，变得健身那就要把这说说哦，俺是不丢人的汤不一些的，那就要把他们话就说说个。但错热把热家本错了，我弄嘛就把的，你的我弄嘛就把的还没话，今年月把那还没话用过了。其实今年什么的，我说哦，俺丢人身边什么俺别。你说不被亚为人什么大的大大恰有什么拿心马来说的，的那个丢了真把的落进去落来似的，俺这个被你说不丢问落被亚不来什么拿心，我那个说不的那马来说的，在这里落进去了，的那上面落进去落来似的。
A key part of the reflection one goes through here is to come to finally recognize what actually is happiness and what is deceptive happiness. Because thus far, what we have experienced as happiness, striven for and achieved, and experienced as happiness, in reality, or in actuality, is not happiness, because it does not last. So again, staying with the illustration of one's body, we can talk about the body, the feelings of happiness or pleasure in relation to the body as either being physical happiness or the feeling of happiness arising from the body. And really, what we're calling happiness in terms of our body, the feelings relating to our body, is that our body, the elements of our body are in balance. That is all. So we feel okay. And then we say, yeah, I feel fine. I'm feeling good today. The energy is excellent, or whatever it may be. When really what we are calling happiness is just being in a state of balance. And when we recognize that what we call happiness is nothing more than a state of balance, we recognize from the usage of the word balance that a balance can so easily be lost, can so easily go out of balance. It does not take much of a cause or condition to come about for one's balance to be lost. The balance of the elements of the body, it doesn't take much for them to be lost. And then suffering arises. Pain arises. It can be slight, can be intense, it can be short-lived, it can be lasting. And here, as an illustration to reflect on, even when someone is sitting, feeling strong and healthy, in reality, or in actuality, they cannot say with any conviction that they are in excellent health. The closest they can say is, as far as I know, everything is fine. Because there are all too many instances of someone being or believing themselves to be in excellent health, but within the elements are not in harmony. There's a cancer perhaps is developing, and they go for a routine checkup, go to routine blood tests, and then they suddenly find out things are very wrong, and that they are actually deeply ill. They just haven't yet experienced the feeling of suffering. So this then is an illustration of this mistaken understanding. So in our third from bottom line, therefore it is a mistake to consider that state to be naturally happy. This is an illustration of that. Sitting thinking everything's great, when actually one inside is diseased, but is still undiagnosed. And this is the illustration of how what we call happiness really is not because in actuality, it is devoid of happiness, because it does not last.
Dine zada dine ki dewa zimba de lo lo she dewa yang da pe dewa de mare karasena kar talaya tamalaya tangan bi chi se de nga de doa lar yang nganru ngebar dungwe tangan bi chi se kasande lar yang ngebar dungwe nganru ngebar dungwe tangan bi chi tamalaya jesa tamalaya ane ko na yo ya da dine chikdu sine ane benanga diroa 아주 미로신에 부를 심제인데 미나다 당보 기회는 수부 당보 되고지 즉 바직 야로 종을 줄을 빼 수부 빼 야고 인지고라 야고라제 된마지 러체셔 두두두 진에 로두지 둔지 계지 굽주세 바 직대냐마게 된두지네 되네 간삼지로 간주 러칭보체 계지 굽주스레도 구교다심 나말이야 조르고도 매바 차르고도 제산 탕안 비치 디서 타말이야 길리길리 둘둘둘 두고래 둘둘 줘야도 코 랑신 코롱을야 아니 약보 매베 따데스 고 뿌이다고 유어줘야 유행하서 삼만나 유어줘야 매바 뿌이다고 신분 되네 줘요 말에 제산 코 공오 하나래 되네게 뿌이다고 매바서 도신 타말랭엔 도신에 시루고래 매바 차르고래 제산 안주기 도신 수부삼 다음에 탕안 비치선 타말이야베 즉 수부기 당디게 냠 되는 지게 뉴슈디게 냠 뉴슈 매바 안 파직 간소르다 니티 sob다르 보시네 안지기 통 마디바 밀 마제바로 차야다 두시는 잔 타말이야 매바 차되네 시세되네 풍보림 때메다 담아 살베나 가르친다지 미 통에 매바 차르고래 세다 당한 비치스
What we will be led through to challenge within us is this mistaken conception that what we experience as happiness is real happiness. So the emphasis here is on the word real happiness, or genuine happiness. This is the mistaken conception. So, for example, when the body is good, perhaps we still in the flush of youth, and the body is looking good and we're feeling good inside. We also have this perception that this state will last. But the reality is, from the moment of conception, this body has been going through a process of aging. So we'd normally say change, but it is also a process of aging. This naturally happens. And with the process of aging comes the process of decline. And when we're younger, this is all too often quite hidden for us. But this is happening nevertheless. The body, as one ages, declines ever more. The signs become apparent, both on what's a visual level, as well as what one is feeling, the changes one is feeling inside. And this decline eventually ends in death. And this is the final part of the sentence. And in the end, it is bad because you will certainly fall into low. In the end, and in the end, it is bad because, maybe just to that, because death will come. Because death will come. And this body that we spent an entire life caring for, so keeping it warm, keeping it dry, making sure it looks good, smells good, and healthy as best we can, in the end, it withers, and it no longer can support life. And it ends up just being placed in a hole in the ground or burnt. And that's all it is good for in the end. Yet, as we live our life, and we're happy with how we're looking, we're happy with how we're feeling, we're completely blind to the reality of our situation. And then when death eventually comes, there remains the position that we may well fall into the lower realms, because we are not yet free to determine our own rebirth, our own place of rebirth.
당한 저기 기부 중요에 남기진 바 시비 갑라 직당보 코로나랑 저기 치워 점바다 안내가 소리 니가 지딘디레 로로네 사지 당보다 지딘디레 로로네 서 기부 중요 값소 시에도 체디기 류롱죄 타다라야 안에 차신지교 말에서 근데 제상한테 류래 차신지교 말에 차바의 신바지교 말에서 대 류기 교인이 가서는 야고 말했어요. 자신이 뭐 윤자에서 야부 판도요 말했어요. 진짜 깨시고 송고 자신지교 말했어. 디 깨부 중요 남유림에 가서 류야 자신지교 가르세네 데네데레서 또 류지 마셔. 나 델야다 만주 류딜이야. 다디 괜 첨부 임바디다 모처로 마서나 만주 류리야. 아니 류딜이야다 괜 가르가래요. tembu kare yore, ane yaklu re, gyubjaya kare, gyu kane sire yongore, ko ngo kane siongore, ane ko takpa tembu kane du gore, sade, nganzu lu liya tasi chayade sungore. Cheza, di sung yode, du shi shimji chayade, dine nganzu lu di, ane oda di dunga, dushi dunga yinba, sade, ngoto gore, shingore. Cheza di, dine du shine ko gyu dang, ngo dang, dine ge, ane chiko takpa tembu yeme du shimji chayade, da nganzu lu di, 근데 가서 두시 동화해야 돼. 뭐 쳐요. 그래. 제산디 뭐 쳐요다 가서 다 균로 통화돼. 가르쳐 버렸어. 니네 균 통화. 다 디디 야고 민도 와서 배섬다데. 다 딜레 야가지 요래요 말해서 섬다데 요래스. 가르스네 녀모 바사바나 제바 빵베 타르바 토베 루디. 디네 강아 디네 요 말해스. 그 개발을 때는 주디어래. 녀모 길에다 녀모 네 개와 말해. 너 코로나야 안에 그 동화 나자 자말 요야기 뭐요 기말 시딘 지금 말했어. 제가다 에디네 강하기네 태요 말했어. 데네 루시 요래서 직 송요도 데네 가르쳐 버스는 안주 루이델때 동화된 괜히 막 통도 다디 뭐 다시다다 야하시는 디 야하도 고도스베 다 남가지 해야 되고 그러다 가지고 제가 안주 루이디 괜히 봐도 너리 뭐 뭐나 딜레 타르제 야가지 고도스베게 삼노데 리고 말이야. 제가 되는 현상 아주 류들이야. 당아주 동화해야 돼. 차와두지 동화세, 두지 동화세 되는데서 뭐저 제가도 괜히 막 통해도 다 되네 제 겸 괜히래샤. 다 디디면 딜레제 야가도 고스면 삼당도 되네 탈바도 되냐서 디리고 해제. 지나디 대 юм내로 디레다고 아주 차와두지 동화세. 뭐저 제고해야 돼. 되네게 짐주지 하고 고고해야 돼. 김제 가르스는 괜히 막 통해서나 딜레 파샤제, 딜레 야가지 타요 라야게 탑시당 보러 와다. 디로 내가 잘할 마서나 교회 마하고는 거 잘하니도 교회나 야도 힘주지기로 교회 받아 어디 민 먹었어. 야가 담고로 어디 나신지 바로 와.
The trainings of a practitioner of intermediate capacity are built on the indispensable foundation of the trainings that are shared with a practitioner of initial capacity. So in the trainings of a practitioner of initial capacity, we looked at the impermanence of this precious human rebirth. So first we recognize just what incredible opportunity we have, but then we recognized that it is finite. And we came to see that this body eventually will not be able to support life. Death is certain. Now, this is being built on, and we come to recognize now in the chapter as it unfolds, that this body is naturally subject to suffering, what's sometimes translated as in the nature of suffering. The body is naturally subject to suffering, which means it can never lead to lasting happiness. So this is a far deeper understanding. Likewise, in the trainings of a practitioner of initial capacity, when we recognize that after this, when death comes, there is the real possibility that one may fall to the lower realms. And that is important because when you recognize what may happen, you then seek something better, which is something similar to what we have now. Another precious human rebirth. Here, we come to recognize that's the foundational meditation, and that gets built on. That whilst it's indispensable, we need to keep achieving excellent rebirths. Actually, we will, as long as we stay bound in samsara, we are subject to suffering. We are not yet freed from suffering. We may, for one lifetime, or for this lifetime now, not in this lifetime, we may be liberated from rebirth in the lower realms. That possibility, though, of falling there remains. And even in this lifetime, when a lifetime in a pleasurable rebirth, one suffers. One is not yet free. So here we see in the trainings of a being of intermediate capacity, one's scope is being raised. One is recognizing that not just getting one more good rebirth is sufficient. One actually needs to gain freedom because one is still subject to all-pervasive suffering of conditionality or compositional suffering. And until one gains freedom from that, one will suffer. So from this, hopefully it's clear how there is a progression in the trainings that the Buddha has laid out. How one builds a foundation and then takes it deeper. And what's important in this is one is pointed out, what is pointed out to one, what we need to recognize for ourselves is our actual situation. And in the instance of these trainings, that we are subject to all-pervasive suffering of conditionality, which means this body, again as the illustration, this body is naturally subject to suffering. That as long as one has a body that has come about from contaminated karma, it is subject to suffering. And this has to be recognized in a way that is not just intellectually understood, but leads to a transformation in terms of where we put our time and our energy. We need to have a transformation in terms of, I have to achieve something better than this. So it's just like if in one's home, one is struggling with a particular task, it takes up a lot of time and it's a bit of a pain. And then a friend says, oh, why are you still doing that? Now you can just buy this thing and it's a whole lot, the problem solved. It gets done much more easily. Oh, you recognize now that the problem can be solved and you'll seek out that solution. So too here, we have to be guided to see that what we've taken for granted as the only possibility, this ordinary samsaric existence, is not. It is continuously subject to suffering. There's nothing worth striving for, but there is something far better, liberation.
sungore 지난 디 개침바 안저 디 하고고 말한저 뒤지 풍부 동아디 동아 임바다 하고고 말해 근데 동아 써야 돼 안저 하고고로 와 동료게 하고고로 와다 지난 되네세 지난 되네자 하 먹어서 다디 하고고를 때 당고 디 신고고를 스페닝 안저 카콤제 카콤베 동아디 하 먹어나 카콤베 동아 써야게 되버기가 말 주동해게 되버기가 말해 지난 카콤베 동아다 하고도 공고베 동아다 하고도 디 써야게 탑람 세야게 듬바 되냐를 끼게 되냐기도 다 디세게 탑비가래서 주동해야 되와 제가 주동해야 됐단 그래서 네 나신 당 아주 뒤지기 동화해야 돼 하고 그거 말 제가 도시는 심주자 하거나 동화들에 탈되게 삼는 끼게 해서 제자디 당보 동화디 뒤지기 동화다 하고 훨씬 고고래지 제가 상이 줍는 디기 와란다서를 최 당보 송유되는 동화 시험을 자 제가 동화디시 하고 그러디 짐주제 디신고 그래 사실은 그러지 진짜 동아 셰바자스 디 동아 셰바자 동아도 쪼어디다 디데 뒤지기 동아 최고래 딩안저기 미기 하고 도마전 당보 디 심주제 동아도 하고 고치게 돼 뒤지기 동아서 하고 고치게 돼 디 하고서는 딘디 방고 그래서 또 송거래
So yeah, it's imperative that one comes to recognize that our aggregates, our body and mind, are flawed. That what we take for granted and think that this is as good as it can perhaps get, or as good as it can perhaps get, is not at all the case. And we come to recognize this through understanding clearly the position we are in. So we all know suffering, the suffering of physical and mental pain, and we do our very best to avoid that. But that understanding of the suffering of physical and mental pain and the resulting wish to avoid it, we need to take to the deepest level of suffering, that of all-pervasive suffering of conditionality. We need to come to recognize that we are subject to that, and thereby give rise to a determination to be freed of it, just like we recognize physical and mental pain as being unwanted, and we do what we can to be freed of it. Likewise, we should come to recognize what all pervasive suffering is and strive to be freed of that. Likewise, for example, if one had some kind of strange condition where one was unable to experience thirst, one would have no idea when one needs to drink. One first has to actually recognize or have this sensation of thirst so as to seek out something to drink. So we need to know what the problem is so as to look for a solution. And this is why in Varanasi, in his very first turning of the wheel of Dharma, the Buddha taught that suffering needs to be known. And when he used the word suffering, of the various types of suffering, he was referring specifically to the all-pervasive suffering of conditionality. This is what needs to be known. Known, understood, recognized. Because it's only through recognizing that we give rise to a determined attitude to be freed from it.
tobu donyi dumba kiyalia tal samna tanda nyamlen chita tila ngone shabada din ma sungore de chirs kiwo tinda tumo we lamje rimba jangbala shis talo jangbala ya samda chiyor desen ma subject ma shiyores dambo dile garsa samba jangwa ngwe se samna tanda jangta ngwe che dine gebe che che dine samna tarba donyi samna de kanes gebe dine skena tarba donyi samna gebare ese gebe che che Della loto sewa siang kashige na ji machine loto de ditires no chujuna di mares passe de loto sewa se jene tarba dribe lam ye rashin de la peba dene tarba toya ne lam kar kum kore se lam de ne kum kore se lam ye anti rashin de ne res tan le ma sun ye de la du shin sung da je da ni shi ru de samba jangwa de ge be che de la loto sewa ane tarba dribe lam ye rashin de la ba se de ko desan ma sun da sabji shi do
So in this way, it's imperative one comes to understand the all-pervasive suffering of conditionality, because it's through knowing this that one will give rise to a wish for liberation from such suffering. So now turning to the text. So at the bottom of page 153, training the mind in the stages of the path shared in common with persons of intermediate capacity has 4 points. So the first point, which is in this chapter, the actual training in the attitude. So this is training in the attitude of a practitioner that is shared with a practitioner of intermediate capacity. And then the measure of its development, this will come in the chapter thereafter, eliminating misconceptions, and determining the nature of the path leading to liberation.
Samba Jawa ngwe sidu da samba jaya gi samba de kan se se di samba de deni shire se de samba le ngothe ngwe song ya sidu samba jaya gi samlo se de deni she se tarba dönyu lo ngwe song wa samba jaya de samba de garasne tarba dönyu lo de se tarba dönyu lo ngwe song wa dan tarba dönyu lo di samba jaya de tarba dönyu lo di ke gore di ngwe song di ani di ke ge tablam garje or sam dang gore se de 디케비 탑셰바 탑소스데 데세니 히우도와 다 타바tunyu 롱을 송하다 디케비 탑세데.
So of those first outlines, our chapter deals with the first of the four. So turning to the top of page 154, the actual training in the attitude. So what does attitude means? It means training to develop the attitude or the wish for liberation from suffering. So this has 2 points: identifying the mind striving for liberation. So striving is this determined attitude to achieve liberation. And then the second point, so the methods for generating it.
탈바 dunye gyu lo se di 탈바 de to gudu sembe lo shike go wa da nzo le di ke go re 다디 탈바 dunye lo di kunlo jeje dine gewa tuya tigire gewa tuya 탈바 dunye lo kene kunlo gewa tuya de ande namje jimba chujun seba chunju samden sherap tuk nyamlen chedire.
The mind striving for liberation is the motivation of a practitioner of intermediate capacity. So this motivation then needs to be cultivated. Then one engages in the various trainings, the accumulation of the causes to achieve liberation. So not trainings, but the accumulation of the causes that will lead to the fulfillment of that aspiration of liberation from suffering. And these are, we would have heard in the past, generosity, ethical restraint, patience, and so forth, those 6. So those are the causes that need to be cultivated, but they require the motivation to be developed. So the motivation is the mind striving for liberation. So we first look at what that is, and then how to cultivate it, the method for cultivating it.
Zanda tarba togudu sembe tarba dunyi gebala an tarba sedi ngo sungo da tarba ngo bazone di togu sembe samle ge yoma jiza tarba sungo sungo ba jiza inzada jiza tarba dunyi ge tarba ngo so tarba sedi karela na tarba ni jingba le zhowas tarba sedi jingba le zhowa la zhowa de le ne tarba la go le jire jingba de le zhowa sedi.
So in this, now looking at the first of these 2 outlines, identifying the mind striving for liberation. So to understand what the mind is that's striving for liberation, one also needs to understand what liberation is. Otherwise one's not going to be striving for anything. One needs to understand what liberation is. So the first sentence then explains what liberation is. Liberation is freedom from bondage.
Zembaru chine ko chilo drosa meba chik kusungwada dine kambe nara shasharwada jeza dele psulo banda zongale tarware la gro pa jingxaba pani gashaba dele ko le songwa na dele tarware la gro then hanzo ya chik modern ala zuji ne ko ra chik be capture then ko chema do je pa twema do ne da di modern chilo targyo marwa ane aji mishanda leje duba chik dine ki kodi ke pa chikar che ko chewe ne dine kanga modern chilo ba tarbarwa dinare drosa meba ka shaba dele ane tarba chu drosa rawa na tarba sigorwa jiza dine tarba sedi jingba le drowa se jingba sedi tik dam jayo rese gare damba resen su demgo resen damya di garsen deyang leyin ni 코월 칭제인스 제가 레다 녀모버니 가지고 코월 파 담샤요 레세 게디나 가브리엘리아 하다 밀리케나 가브리엘리아 둔돌리케야 또 가브라니 또 레다 녀모버니디 마방 게디나 디니디게다 타발마소나 누구 따샤바 세오레 제가 디기 두세 레다 녀모버이게 담고레 담샤바레스 제가데 담간의 수익되는 징간의 징지에 가려서 레다 녀모뭐 징바레스 제제 징바레스 제가 디 징바를 탈바했나다 징발을 들어 와서 그래서 대 레다 녀모뭐 이니 코버 징지에 나서 가와를 친구로서 코와를 징거래 지래 징지에 나서 어디
In the first sentence here, we see what the meaning of liberation is: freedom from bondage. So then what is bondage? Now the second sentence, karma and afflictions bind one, so binding or bonding. Karma and afflictions bind one in cyclic existence or samsara. So what is it that liberation is freedom from? It's freedom from being bound in cyclic existence by karma and afflictions. So liberation is freedom from the afflictions which lead to the accumulation of contaminated karma. So how we use this word liberation or freedom in society can be very similar to what is meant here. So when a prisoner is released from prison, they are freed from prison, or they are liberated from prison. So we'd say they're freed. They're freed from prison. So this is similar. Being freed from freeing ourselves from the prison of samsara means we are freed from contaminated karma and afflictions. Well, another illustration is if one is in quite a bad car accident. And emergency services come and they cut one out of the car. Then one is freed from the wreck, the car wreck. So similarly, so these two illustrations are similar to when one gains freedom or liberation from cyclic existence. One is freed from the fetters or the binds or the restraints of contaminated karma and the afflictions. One is no longer controlled by them, trapped by them.
다데네게 칭제디데 레다 뇨모분이데스 디니기 가와 담고라선다 디니기 왕기 감기 왕기 되감소 숨당서래 제자다 감기 원도 제나 되베감 수감 수메감 숨레 담고라시 가브릴레다 뇨모 왕기 가브릴레 수감레 기고라 가브릴레 수메레 기고라 가브릴라 되베감나 마긴 두신 담 기고레 담고 담사디디레스 숨당서 아니 감유원에 치는 숨지 조여건의 체나 당하서 나라 소바 당 암죽세데 디디레다 베는 아주 냐와 이다 눈조 숨제 아니 하다 미세데 집에는 가차르고래 안지 냐와 이다 눈조 숨제 미세 할래야 아니 하마인세다 하다 하마인 집에는 죽차고래 나지도 하마인데 하나를 뒤셔오는 나세지고래 된다지 바래 지자데 조여건의 체바이나 아니 나세야 되지 나한테는 막 누시네 지니 요건에 채나 아니 니엘이 조요건에 시디바샤 지니 제라고 봐. 숨당 조요건에 그 조요건에 채나 살아서 봐 암죽 세디바도 봐.
So liberation is freedom from being bound in cyclic existence, and what is binding us in samsara are the karma and afflictions. The text continues, through the power of these two, karma and afflictions, the aggregates, the physical mental aggregates, are reborn in one of the three realms. So the formless realm, the formed realm, or the desire realm, such as the desire realm, as one of the 5 or 6 types of beings, such as gods. So the 5 or 6 types of beings, so this would refer to the 3 lower realms, the human realm, so making 4, and then the god realms, making 5. Or the god realms can be subdivided into 2, that of gods and demigods, suras and asuras. So in this way, 5 or 6 realms. It's just a different way of enumerating the realms. So this is where one is born, and one is born through the power of karma and afflictions. Or the word power can be under the control of karma and afflictions, not under our own control, not with freedom or free will, but under the control or power of karma and afflictions.
나 기니 요거네 오늘 제바이나 델레 티카스네 기니 요거네 나라 소바 시르스 풍보 인선 자와니 징병오 인베스데다 나라 소바스네 나이게 공게 나네 죄게 주게시 제자 레다 뉴모와 갑레 나게 차고레 갑레 주도 기고 갑레 죄시레 게바 차고레 갑레라 아네 가소레 공안레 게바지 두시용고레 제자 두시네 제자 님 시다 시 풍보를 인삼 자와니 되네 징바셔야 돼 인삼 자와니 징병오월라 제자 레다 뉴모 라와 메바 가브릴레야 수부 되발레게 가브릴레야 술이케왈레 가브릴레 수메케왈레 가브릴레 냐와 가브릴레 둔도 가브릴레 라 가브릴레 미 가브릴레 하마이 가브릴레다 공할레 게방할레 밀게 나게 잘레게는 공하게 바로와도 공할레 게바다 드레레 게바 아니 드레실레 게바데네 주기에서 두시네 레다 뉴모 옹게딘 게바데다 마라도 용고레스 제가 꼬라 호시키디 거레스 제가 디니기 게바데 레다 뉴모 옹게 라와 메바디슬레도 꼬라 게브지 게 되바데라 징바셔야 디라고레 징바셔야 디레스 보라 징병오 인베 상황이요. 징병오 인베에서 징바샤디.
The text then continues. Let's read this again. Through the power of these two, under the control of karma and afflictions, the physical mental aggregates are reborn in one of the three realms, such as the desire realm, is one of the 5 or 6 types of beings, such as gods, and in one of the 4 birthplaces, such as a womb. So one can be born in a womb, one can be born from an egg, one can be born in a spontaneous birth, or due to heat and moisture. So these are the 4 birthplaces, or Tibetan's birthplaces, but maybe birthplaces, ways of birth. The womb, the egg, spontaneous birth, heat and moisture. So these are the 4 ways that one can be born, or 4 places, and this is the meaning of bondage. So what's presented here is that what one is liberation, because this is identifying the mind striving for liberation. So liberation is being liberated or freed from being bound in cyclic existence, or in samsara, due to contaminated karma and afflictions. So what is it that binds us? Are our contaminated karma and afflictions. And they bind us through controlling our rebirth, or having complete power over our rebirth. As our karma and afflictions are determines which of the 3 realms and in which of the 4 means of birth we take, life after life after life. Never do we have control over it. Our karma and afflictions have control over it. This is the meaning of bondage.
Kawachile Tasha Vaina. Go Dimale Bardo Korong, Tawa de Kawa, Naso Badu Koraj, Kawadron, Dimado, Chilo Dile Tandros Yomarvada. Jezada Tasa Kawa de Chikche, Kawachitua. Tene Tayagi Semjeniche, Tene Karita Gorsan Tawachi, Sumdua Dinaje. Tanga Dida Shibare. Might be that the Semjen, the Kilabna, Talamna, the Tasa Taya, Semjen Shore, the Semjan Carpatiana, Judo, Kishina, Tashavena, that Tasa Kawashi, this Tayagidi, Semjen Kina, that Tainache. They got it with Tawachi Tasha. Tambo de Kawa. Did my Tasa Joro, Kawa and Himbo and Joro, the Mazuja, Teletasa dice. Jezada Semjen di Gele Tapa Cheche and Tapana Nejik Pagawa, the Damshavene, didn't Semjen Drosso Yomar has a Tapa de Tensharwa, and Drosso Gods getting a Gawa Dam de Cordigore, and Cordigoro. And the Tapa de Jeshavena, Tapa Jeshavena, Tapa Medatan, Meva Seshavene, didn't go Koran Kawa and the Ding, Dros Deva del Dry Yorwa, or Dirwa, on Bedina she. Nanzo Taxa de Garsene, Deva. They come down, Sume comes, the Kawanashi, the Kawanashi. Da can Tawanashi, the lead and Yomo Badiche. The Surius and the same gentike. Chesan lead and Yomo Badigipa, Gidina, Tasa Kawalmason, comes from the Patasha, Teletire, Magidina, led and Yomo, Gabriel, Devaki, Gabriel Sulikam, Sumileke, Gabrielia, and the Gongaleke, Gabriel, and the Nike, and the Gabriel Trege, Gabriel Zige, Dusen Tire, Malaysia. Jezada Tayagi, led and Yomo Badifa, Meva Soshabaina, then the Digitapan and Jevan Tibaroa. Jezada, Sosugi, led and Yomo Bajevina, Meva Soshabaina. Then come delegate Yomar, Rawan Bevakia Chagomar. She's not Giva Chago. Then is that, and ya Tarpa said it to Gorege. Chesadan and Zugi, Billy Tisha, Chesa, Delia, comes from the Taksadi, Jingsadi, comes from the chair, Jingin Jingji, and Leda Yomo by the chair, Sujingors and Ganazo, Delia Tasha Gorege, Leda Yomo big comes from the Tasha, but the Chipare, Tasha Baresur.
One doesn't see it so much anymore, but if you think of, say, a dog tied to a post in the garden, there to be a guard dog, or if you think of in a zoo, a tiger tied or chained to a post, what we see there is these animals, the dog or the tiger, they are restricted. They are bound to this post, and they really have no freedom. No one will look at that that dog or that tiger and say, oh, they're enjoying a free life. Clearly, they are bound and have no control over themselves. They cannot go beyond the length of the rope or chain. So here we see three components. We have a sentient being, we have a post, and the sentient being then is tied to that or bound to that post. But should what binds them break, or they cut through it, then we'd say they are freed, they are liberated, they can now run wild, they are free again. So this is an analogy to the position we find ourselves in. So we remain, although we take rebirth after rebirth after rebirth, we do this without any control, without any free will. What has control are these fetters or these binds that keep us shackled or trapped in cyclic existence, namely our contaminated karma and our afflictions. It's this that binds us in this wheel of cyclic existence and ensures we remain in this prison of samsara. It ensures that we have no freedom. We do not choose our place or of rebirth or the manner of rebirth. We do not choose the realm. We do not choose whether we are born from a womb or an egg and so forth. Our karma and afflictions have complete power and control over that. But when we break these binds or these ties of karma, karma and afflictions, then we are liberated. We are free. And we are liberated from our karma and afflictions, liberated from cyclic existence, from samsara.
지산 딜레 조안이 타르바오스. 지산 딜레 조아시데 레다 뇽몽 원기 아니 코알레 깨와 딜레 조아. 지지데 코알레 깨 모고와 차소나 다 딜레 조. 조바스. 레다 뇽몽 원기 코알레 깨 미고바 데 자바이나 미스에투바이나 딜레 조바레. 지산 딜레 조아데 딜레 타르바라게레스. 지산다 돈달라 레다 뇽몽 원기 코알레 깨와 미게와데 스웨투바이나 디는 달바레 저러다 달바레스.
Reading the whole of the second last sentence. This is the meaning of bondage. Therefore, freedom from this is liberation. So we see here in the outline, identifying the mind striving for liberation. So what is liberation? It's freedom from bondage. What is the meaning of bondage? It's contaminated karma and afflictions. It is that which binds us. These are the ropes or the chains that bind us in this wheel of cyclic existence, in this process of continued rebirth, this prison of samsara. And then it's freedom from these chains or these shackles, namely karma and afflictions. That is liberation. Liberation from cyclic existence.
코알레 깨와딜 드로바이나 다 타르바레스 제자다 코알레 깨 고고 말바다 제자다디 녀모바 빵바이나 빵요도 제자다 녀모바 빵요도 코알레 탈고 그래서네 코 먼저 타발 마소나 메아서샤르와 다 담이야 타바나신디 녀모바 차 녀모바데 빵샤바이나 되네 코알레 깨디 깨요 말 라면 코알레 깨디 차고 말 제자 탈바레스 제자 탈바세 탈방에서 와서 뒤에다 레다 녀모 원게 라면보 코알레 깨와딜레 드나 디 탈바레스 제자 탈바레스 탈보스 제자다 탈바드니로 세디 데토버드바네 탈바드니로스 제자 레다 녀모모 라면보 깨와딜레 탈바네 드로와디 탈바디 다디토부도 디나 델레 디토부도 셈비게 돈예게 삼바 깨야딜라 델레 안에 탈바드니로 라기레스 디토버드바네 탈바드니로스.
So I hope now it is very clear what liberation or freedom means and what one is gaining freedom from, which is being tied or bound by or shackled by our karma and afflictions. And of these two, it's really the afflictions that when one eliminates them, one will be freed. It's really the afflictions which in our imagery in our imagery, we can imagine them as being the chains that bind us in samsara, or the bars on the window of the prison of samsara. It's these afflictions. When they are destroyed, one is liberated from the prison of cyclic existence. One is freed from having to take uncontrolled rebirth in the three realms of samsara. So this then is the meaning of freedom. Freedom from bondage is the meaning of liberation. In the final sentence, the wish to attain this mind, striving for liberation, is what one's striving for. So it's not just to merely understand what is liberation and what is one is being liberated from, but it's to take that further and develop this yearning for freedom.
아니래디 타바등이다 타바등이 롱어서 와서 디시오다 타바등이 로세 가네시 라그리에 세도다 타바등이 로 게호레 곰호레 세도 다 삼다야데 가르치 무슨 거래스네 진짜 레다 녀모와 라와메 코와레 게와레 조와디 타바지 다딜레 조고도 디 톱고도 선비게 되네 조와디 톱고도 선비게 삼다야데 타바등이 로 디야네야도 고미야데 기브징이 가서 냠렌제 타바드 삼다야데 조디레다 디야네야도 디케에게 된다라야 타바등이게 로디 다 타바 코르 마서 코알레 드레비게 드레베 타르바 토구도스 밀로 제알야 근데 코알레 견동 거래 다 코위에 견나네 다된 아주 뒤식이 풍부해서 견동 대자 델레 견동에도 다 델레데 타고스 비게 일리 거래 근데 델레 타고스 빌레 야데 둥아 오시네 둥알레 타르게 삼바제디 타바더니 로시기 거래 제데 진짜 저다 디기부 딩이 값소 운노로 마서나 아주 머레데볼 마서나다 저디레다 디레
One needs to develop this mind that is striving for liberation. So it's beyond a mere wishing for liberation, but it's a determined attitude, so a striving for liberation. And what is it then that one is striving to be liberated from? So it's a mind that wants freedom from the afflictions, because one has recognized it's these afflictions that bind us within the suffering realms of samsara. So wanting to be freed from suffering is something we all have. But here it needs to be directed towards what is actually binding us, and that is the afflictions. Because as long as one is afflicted, one will remain chained in this prison of suffering. So to generate this yearning and this determined striving attitude for liberation, that requires a method. And that method, you can see it's where we're coming to, that method is to come to recognize the faults of samsara. That's some cyclic existence. Samsara is in the nature of being subject to suffering. As long as one is in this prison, one will suffer. And when reflecting on the faults of samsara, one needs to, in particular, get to recognize the all-pervasive suffering of conditioning. That level of suffering is what we need to gain freedom from. So developing this mind, this determined attitude to gain freedom from the afflictions, to gain freedom from the all-pervasive suffering of conditionality, this is the motivation of a practitioner of intermediate capacity. It is, in the analogy I often use, it is the driver behind the car that is driving towards liberation. It is this determination to gain freedom from suffering through, to gain freedom from the afflictions because of having recognized the all-pervasive suffering of conditionality.
Samnoti ke be masida ke chisho nane chisho chadore be ge chimbore da di zoro chagore chisa dine zada di tarpa tengyo lo se da de shi ngan ju chisa da di samnoti ke wala garko sene de shi kyaba du ju dunga de ya dunga yimba de moche ba ya go moche go gore di moche ya de ane dunga she ba ja se sangye jumnen di ane tenshi cho so be tenshi dunga she ba ja se dunga 신고하래. 다 동아 시아바자스도 되네 손는다 사상이 좀 이바데 가르송하스네 군중 봉화자스. 제산의 동아기 군중 봉화자스도 동아기 규리 갈 때는 연구를 동아하고는 디 규가를 내용 거를 규대하고 오시게 됐어. 규대하고도 유디 군주 내다 녀몬 받는 게와 하고 그래서 제자다 코알의 계기 규디 내다 녀몬 받에 니 방고 그래서 송을 제자다들 디레 당아서 디 방바에는 코알 좋아. 팅제 다디 손에 띵아서 코알이야 친지들 내다 녀몬 받에 니파 델레 줘봐 있나 디 방바에는 델레 줘봐래 타바래 송도와 다디 손에 디로 제자 den지가 수송여도 제자다 군주 방와자 세데 지부지가로다 동아의 유 차와듯이 동아의 규디가서 규디 때네 안 파티 방고래 세되다 규디 파심지 레다 녀모바 디군주래 다 디방고래 사실 지산디 송타 식 배시다나 할만 된다 지부지가로다 디로다
Developing this yearning for liberation is an absolutely crucial mind. Amongst the several extremely important minds in the Dharma, this is one of them. It is absolutely indispensable for ourselves. So to develop this yearning for liberation, one needs to have come to the point where one wholeheartedly rejects cyclic existence. One does so through understanding that samsara is pervaded by suffering. There is no corner in samsara that one can hope for where one will be freed of pain. This understanding of the pervasive nature of suffering in samsara comes through reflecting on the all-pervasive suffering of conditionality and leads to a rejection of hope for happiness in samsara. So this, you'd know the expression from the Buddha, from his first teaching at Varanasi, suffering needs to be known. And it's referring to suffering at this level. When one recognizes the pervasiveness of suffering in cyclic existence, one will want to know, what is the cause for this suffering? Because if I know what the causes are, then I know what I need to not accumulate, what I need to purify, what I need to abandon. And those causes are the very fetters or the binds, what binds us in samsara, karma and afflictions, particularly the afflictions. It's these that need to be abandoned. It's karma and afflictions which are the origin of our suffering. Our suffering needs to be known. And in particular there, all-pervasive suffering of conditionality needs to be known. And the origin of our suffering, karma and afflictions, need to be abandoned. So from how I'm expressing this, you will be hearing two different ways combined in one of how to talk about this. The one that I've been referring to is true sufferings and true origins, where one comes to know true sufferings, and thereby, when one knows or recognizes for oneself true sufferings, one seeks out the origin of sufferings, and thereby strives to abandon those causes. Now, that's the way that I've alluded to, and it's the way that will be presented soon. But the way that's been presented thus far is that one needs to recognize our situation in samsara, that as long as we are within samsara, we are subject to suffering. It may be manifest, it may not be manifest in any moment, but it is in the very nature of our samsaric existence that we are subject to suffering. And that suffering has its causes. Those causes are what bind us within samsara, and that is our contaminated karma and our afflictions. So that is the way that's presented here in this verse, and there's a different way of expressing it, which we'll come to, which is through the Four Noble Truths.
동아 타다를 끼비 뉴바의 겸내 권수선 요 껴고리에서 이체 제대 겸로식으로 다디 마든다 시에도 가래 상여 줌내에 겹된 법 버려시데 Sangye Jumden the Dunga Sege Tablam the Sunsha, etc. Delia Sumba Dela, that Manoa Sumba Dela, Ichia down, De Sumba de Manova, Tata Yimba the Ichia the Cameras. Cesar the Sangye the Carson was in it, did it, Dunga Sheva Cha, Kunjupa Jazz. This Sangye Jumden, Lamden did it, that's a Sangye Jumden, Captain Bobo, Captain Bobo, Sangye Jumden, Captain Bobo, that you call somebody. Noa don't true Tata Yo, Tende Noa the true kind me, call somebody Yamlin, somebody Tabla the Apple Sunger as a Yiche Daddy, San Yukoncha Capsurova, Chagarova. Chesada San Yusuya did it, Dunga Sheba Cha, Kunjupon Chas. Chesada, Kabaduji Dunga Jadinga to Hakore, water shekores. Chesada Motrene, D. You and Yomoba, Duku Yomoba Hawkores, Kunjus Hawkores, that is Della Sebane, Kovala Chinje. Pukawaduji Koala Chinji Yomobade, the Hawk, the Bangores. Chesa Sanyi Tablam di Sunshare, Chesa di Data Chaturwa. Now the Negi Sanyi Sumbadi Naso Yamlin Jeje Yomoba the Bambaina Tarvas Tokores. That dinner that there's a Tarva said, Jinwal draw the Tarva in Sunsoa, Jinwal draw at Tavares. Chesada, Denshiko Shedu, Yomobo Kunjum, Bambadi, Tarvares Sunroa. Chesada. Chekonjo said the Chekonjo like Yapsudua City. Jesa Sanji Sumbadi, then Kabadu Dunga the more Hako, Sanyu Sumba Naja, Tablan Demba Damba Hako, then you Kunju in Bahako, then you Kunju Boy Tablaya, Jan Yamlin Jane, and Yamlin Chivel Lamdi, and the Lamde. Tin Yamso Dembatine, the Yom of the Banyud, Taba Tokure, Sembe Yichi said, that Taba Tobna, Taba Toydu, that's also Taba Toyodu, then Garsorio, Yomoba Tadale Draw, then call a Jobarwada, Tadale Drona, call a Jobarwada, Tarwara, Chesan Joburis Ichedi, Chesan di Donati Chichago, Chesan Jamros, and Samtadu, Taran Donatili order.
Hopefully now it's also clear how what is presented here in this outline, identifying the mind striving for liberation, is also an introduction to the Four Truths for Aryas, the Four Noble Truths. Also, by engaging in the reflections that are to be presented, on the basis of the reflections that you have already done, what you are going to come to, the reflections you will come to, will deepen the reflections on the topics you've reflected on already. For example, or in particular, that of refuge. So we've already looked in some detail at turning to the three jewels for protecting refuge. But here, as one reflects on the trainings shared with the practitioner of intermediate capacity, one's refuge also deepens. Because whilst in our prior training, we turn to the three jewels for protecting refuge, from falling into the suffering of the lower realms. Here we come to recognize that the founder Buddha, the Buddha jewel, the Buddha was the one who taught the actual causes, the actual nature of samsara, that one is subject to suffering. And he taught that this suffering must be known and its origins need to be abandoned. So our faith, our trust in the Buddha deepens, recognizing that he has described perfectly why we continue to suffer. And he also, of course, taught the path to freedom. And this is what we strive to cultivate in terms of cultivating the Dharma jewel within. The Dharma jewel necessarily being the other two noble truths, true paths and true cessations. The true paths that one develops within one's mind, and the cessation of the various levels of cessation, where one eradicates the various degrees of subtlety of afflictions. So here one's faith in both the Buddha jewel and the Dharma jewel, and therefore the companions one has, the Sangha jewel, all deepen. So this is how then the reflections we are starting on will help to deepen the reflections on other topics that you've already engaged in.
Mm-hmm. 제가 도시네 양한테 남미 지단에다 denshi siri, denshi chungor siri, chiki samdada dundade kaagari bushide. Yang di kiamdro siri yang dundada kaagari bushide. Da dini ma jivu tingda tumo lamiriba lo chan siri dundada kaagari bushide, nga zi samda di jik kuwa tuwar di kura. Chisan dundada samdang wana, jikbi jikyang dundada ngowa sungtang mira mada, tablam sungtang kaagari mada, dundada babsa jikba riche. Chisan dini sha nga zi hago yudu, chisan denshi kiamdro samdang yudu, chisan kiamdro samdang yudu, dini dushi pumbo ngo iba ngo shingba na de yu da le da nyomo ba ba bang je de le tar go do se be tarbe taba to de gyab ngo ro wa je san gyab ngo sem ta di re da de sam ta re je da de ji chogo sam ta de dunga de ba ki dunga dushi pumbo dunga iba ngo she di yu an de kun ju de ba nyomo ba ha go di bang go go re sa de da di re da di na nga ju gyab bu ting de tumo la mi se de song yo de 다 캬바디지 동아 두시 공부 동아 이번 뭐시 니유 코갈레 친지 규디 녀모바에 제가 녀모바도 빵고 거래 제가 녀모 빵바에는 탈바스 토고래 제가 디 탈바 토이 동이 이렇게 거래서 두신에다 돈다두스데 밥사지고 돈다지고 샤고 제가 두섬다베든 겸르고 섬다나 람사 딘시고 섬코도 그래 대기우진의 투모라미르바 섬다도 그래 대기우진의 투모라미르바 로자라 섬다남라 겸르디기 슈처줘야 줘야당 denshi ane chunggo go samdade dondadigi samdade deriga chaza dushine babsa jigbaza chaza dushine chaza hago yode dene mangbu lojonji je moade dene ko chasan imporoji cha dondajigba nyamne je tuwa chagorowa 제가 디 냠네 제여도 아주 denshi 고 냠네 지고래 냠로 냠네 지고래 냠로 냠네 지도 denshi 냠죠 다들 기부팅도 투모라미리 바 냠네 지고래 자산 냠네 지도고 제자다 두시는 아주 로정 제자 하고 하 먹었다 냠로시데 가가지 den시다 저와 메티가지 den시스도 대수 기부팅나 저와 메티가지 기부팅 유럽저지도 냠로 배 가가 denshi chogola kaga pe kaga imba manzu samlo deni kordi korwa cheza di reyo mara karenda donda babsa jikbare cheza dusa hago yondu manzu ta jikba charo cheza deni zada nyamne jide samlo jikdan pechi jikda lobjong che samlo dan gomjedu cheza di suwa di su donda jikbare sen chasangda ribo yata ribo samlo na ribo maso na mangbo shiuji samlo na letuwa chago re
I want to use this link between that I've shown now between how one through one's developing of the understanding of a practitioner of intermediate capacity, how it deepens one's refuge, a training included within those trainings shared with the practitioner of initial capacity. So that's just one illustration, but I want to use this illustration to counteract a common misconception. So we take a Lamrim text, and they're divided in a variety of chapters. These chapters are individual topics of training. And this is and it's presented in this way because this is the sequence upon which one trains one's mind. A common mistake, though, is to see these chapters as separate. That one's complete, now I move to that one. And what's done before is now in the past, now I'm doing this one. And the mistake that's all too often made is they are seen as separate, as distinct, whereas in reality they are mutually dependent. One builds upon the other, but the sequence is more circular than linear in that whilst the initial training is the foundation for the later training, which itself is the foundation for the training beyond that, as one engages in the third and fourth trainings, for example, these serve to deepen the prior trainings. So they are not separate, but they are mutually dependent, building one upon the other, not just in a linear way, but actually in a circular manner. So here, when one comes to understand all-pervasive suffering of conditionality, or to put it in less words, when one comes to know suffering, but in particular it's this level of suffering, then that is the level of suffering one will want freedom from. Not just freedom from suffering in the lower realms, but freedom from being freedom from being bound in cyclic existence. This will then, so that's true sufferings. Then that leads one to, so what is the origin? What is the cause of my suffering? Contaminated common afflictions. It's that I need to eradicate. So here, through this deeper knowledge then, one's refuge gains a more power, more depth rather, so does one's recognition of the preciousness of this life, and therefore the need to make the most of it, and so forth. So these latter meditations build on the former meditations, but they also strengthen those former meditations. One's refuge becomes deeper. One's appreciation for this opportunity deepens. Then a second key point to make. So the first was not to see trainings as separate, but really mutually dependent. Second key point to make is, from this we can hopefully see why it's necessary to have a broad education and a deep education. Because if one just says, I want to know the essence, I don't need to know all the details. The less one knows, the less of these, the fewer links one will see, and one will struggle to gain much depth in one's practice. But as one continues to develop one's education, hearing the same teachings on similar topics or the same topics again and again, as one is growing over time in terms of through one's spiritual training, teachings on those same topic carry greater meaning for you and bring about a deeper understanding. So from both of these points, that the various topics are not separate, but mutually dependent, and that one benefits greatly from a broad and deep education, from this we can recognize that seeing some trainings, these are introductory, these are the preliminaries. Looking, in a sense, deprecating, looking down on them is completely mistaken, but rather recognize that these are both the foundation for what will come later, and what comes later strengthens and deepens that foundation.
Nyomo pa de nyomo pa de cheza nyomo pa za de nyomo pa de jamdre jene jamdre lapchala de nyomo pa de geru gewadu ya karasin jimba chudun soba chudun samde sherap de nyamna je de ra jamdre jene jamdre ge lapchala lawor karasin jamwe tarba de jamwe de chokon jang gile geworo di gewala sanye jomne de nyamna je lamden je de labko ko jamdre lapchala lap the Jamdo Labjala Malabna, Jamwe to tomorrow, Jamwe Rangular Duala, Jamdo Labja Lab said, Jamkora, Jadegars, Jimba Sudu, something sherap did it, Dijadere, or Jamdo Labja Labs did it. That dinner, San Yujum then the Dinju course to Dunga Sheba, Kunju Power Jasela. That Kunju Paya Dondala, Lam Castle, Lamunducha, Castle, Lam Gombas, Lam Gongo, Lam Gomia Garrison. Jimbo Children Sewa someday share up today, Dinyam Jere, or do share. That I'm going to Delia Carasosan, Tarba look here, Tarba to Lariva. That Tarba to be a top Jere, Jimbo Children Sewa someday share up here, Dinyam Jere. Jeza, Jamdre Jene, Jamdre Labja Laviagi, Lavio Due, Carlavasine, so Jimbo Children Sewa someday share up to Dinyam Jere. That Deji Chosone, Gobongo de Chicasa, Lam Gombercha said Sanji Lam Gomgure Sonadia, Comieto, the Jimbo Children Sunday share up to today. That another Digo to share on the Tarba Dundu and the Tarba Toya de Lam Gomgure said the Gomgargorosene, Jimbo Children Sunday share up to it. I did it. Jeza Jamdu Kabe, Jamdu Labja Lavia, so Persian, Jiso Persian Juk. And give Deji Cho Kalashi Sun do Lam on the Chas, Lam Yamna Jeda, Dirwa. And the day that day, Nazu de Givutin the Tumo Samba George Tarba doing, then the Tarba to Lam Yamna Jede, Jimbala Sobo Judy. Then Junju Na Sonia did it. As Sonia did Sunta Miramado, Junju Na Sonia de Kizim, and the day. Gas Diva Pangore, Tisha or Chicken, the Chesed Chazan, Nyomo Pantha Tisura. That in Ma Lam Yamne Jedegasin, Jimba to Sudan, that's about something, Liu, something like here, you in Pine Sungorva, and that Chasan Chipar. Dennis do some Chesa Shungarta Vene, Papsa, Yamnes is a Chipar.
One of the latter sections in the refuge chapter were the refuge precepts, or the trainings of going for refuge. In other words, the trainings to engage in, to strengthen one's refuge, to live in accordance with protecting refuge. And these were expressed in varying ways, but it comes down to the need to abandon non-virtue and accumulate virtue. Now, and that was then presented in some detail afterwards in the Karma chapter. But now through what has just been presented and will later be presented in more detail, is when it comes to abandoning non-virtue, it's really talking about the afflictions. The afflictions will be expressed through our physical behavior, verbal behavior, and that we know we need to abandon. But we need to get to what's beneath that, beneath the physical and verbal non-virtue, and that's the afflicted motivation. So here, when one's education deepens, one's understanding of the refuge trainings deepens, and one recognizes that in order for the three jewels to, for the protection that the three jewels offer to be actualized or received by oneself, it's our afflictions we need to abandon. And not only do we need to abandon non-virtue, namely the afflictions, but we also need to accumulate virtue. And this we've heard about before with the four trainings of ethics, generosity, patience, and joyous perseverance. Here, we will hear about those again. This is the method by which one accumulates virtue, but one will also add to this concentration and wisdom. So here, concentration and wisdom together with the other four trainings of generosity, ethics, patience, and joyous perseverance. These are the cultivation of what will become true paths. So when Buddha Shakyamuni taught the Four Noble Truths, or a better translation is the Four Truths for Aryas, because noble is the word for Arya beings. So the Four Truths for Aryas, he said that suffering needs to be known. Origins need to be abandoned, cessations need to be actualized, and true paths need to be cultivated. So here we've spoken about that suffering needs to be known, its origins, karma and afflictions, need to be abandoned, and the way to get there is to cultivate true paths, namely generosity, ethical restraint, patience, joyous perseverance, concentration, and wisdom. So here, we are now talking about 6 practices. Before it was 4. And later, these same 6 practices will be suitable to be called perfections. This presentation that we are growing into here, the trainings being shared with the being of intermediate capacity, is not something unique to the Lamrim. The sequence is clearly presented in the Lamrim, but this is the presentation of the teachings of the Buddha. So when one comes across teachings in another text, such as what we've been covering on Wednesday night, Shantideva's engaging in the Bodhisattva's way of life. There, Shantideva, with different words, has been presenting something very similar. He spoke previously about the need to abandon the afflictions and the need to accumulate virtue. So therefore, we've had a presentation on purification. We've had a presentation on generosity. We're coming towards the end of the presentation on ethical restraint, and soon we'll come to the presentation on patience. So in this way, we see that in other texts, such as Shantideva's, the topics are the same. The sequence and the presentation, this will vary, but the way of actually training is as is presented here.
미라마도 돈다 닝보들 진보 추르서와 전에 삼대 라바도 시 삼대다 신내다 동방이 또 베시랍 다 삽게 개발요래 이곳 사바다 베들 지켜버려 대자 냠내 제조 아까 냠내 제 디레 진바도 추르서바체 되네 삼대다 동방이 또 시랍 제자 냠내 제 디레다 송담이다 미라데 제상은 어도당 가서 백커 가가래 삼다데 된시해요 말. 그래서 냠내제 디레 돈나 인보디 다 되네 띵해진다 진바 추르셔버 전제시 디가래 띵해진다 동반이 또 베셔라. 다 동반이 또 베셔르지도 아주 뒤에까지 시 동반이 또 베셔다 많이 틱 나가까지 시 동반이 시라 띵해진 신내디게 사보 시우 용거래. 다디 마도 돈다라 디스 냠내제 디레. 제가 이마도 개발한 민도아. 제가 차상다 돈달라 상기 고방 토발라 녀모바디 방고를 받아가서 녀모바 디버 방고를 디버 방에 탑람들려야다 미소소라는 게 원보 잡중의 박백에 다 되네기 들어와. 배나가서 시드니를 들어오면 미변주 시주랑 무약고 이런 넘들 들어와셔도와. 아직까지 저라면에 뭐라 다지 들어와. 아직 뭐라 봐 당도야. 가지 공부하자 들어와. 조사 집어차도와 조당카가 앞에서 여러봐다 소수게 니벌 밥베게 조당카가 여러봐 디나시 냠는 제다 밥 조사 상제설 줘야 빵야 녀모고 빵야 집바 조사 상제설 줘야 집바 빵사 다 가와 친구들서 녀모버디 친구들다 돈달랑도 녀모데 빵고래 제가 녀모고 빵야게 탑란들 점도 제고래 점도 납절라고래 세야다 안된시고 손에 냠는 제야다 기부 체중 충수 남미진 바시야다 되네 전주 손야다 되네 나게 냠는 제고야다 세도 차사다 녀모 봐야 된다 손고래 제가 녀모 봐야게 탑람들이 또 고미야 가르스는 진보 수련서 버전을 삼대시라베 이마도요 말해
And when it comes to the practices of secret mantra, what they come down to is a different method for achieving the same result: the eradication of the afflictions and the strengthening of virtuous minds through the six perfections. So, secret mantra differs from sutra in terms of the presentation and the words, but what it comes down to is the same thing. One's cultivating the six perfections in order to abandon the afflictions. The one area where secret mantra does differ is in terms of the quality, the power and the power of the mind that is developed by means of secret mantra and used to realize emptiness. The emptiness that is realized is the same, but the realizing mind is far, far more powerful. But that mind that is being developed through the practices of secret mantra is engaging in the practices of generosity, ethical restraint, patience, joyous perseverance, concentration, and wisdom. Those same six perfections. And doing so with the same motivation, through cultivating virtuous minds, abandoning non-virtuous minds with their afflictions, in order to become a Buddha for the sake of others. This is like if one wants to go to Sydney, one can go there by varying means. One can fly, one can go by car or motorbike or by train, but there are different means to arrive at the same destination. So for the destination for a practitioner of great capacity, their destination is Buddhahood. And to become a Buddha, to attain Buddhahood, the afflictions need to be abandoned through the strengthening of virtuous minds. And this can be done by means of training in sutra or training in tantra, which is based on sutra.
gare odiji sungore diji back koron kha jo gune meden chi samdi goro wada odi ngadi lamrim nyamne chi nga junju ji de ada ji ngajim ada jamro samda de ji dile di kara junju chene nyamne ji ya ro asa dene samda ngazli yonsi garo kasi nengadi ha고 go mare 제사도 롭죠 마제바는 퇴바 마제바는 제산 퇴바 제바는 퇴는 디디레데스 봐 라르셔도 어디 디디레도 와선베든 지버레도 가르냠네 제베네 겸르 돈에 냠네 제베네 상지고바도 탈바 탐지kim고 와도 냠네 지고레 대시 돈에 냠네 제베는 디지고레 나 기부 치르슈 람비 돈에 디네 디지고레 예 준주 냠네 제베는 디레 나 냠네 제베는 디레 제자다 돈다 상요고바 토에 탑라냠네 지부지야 캬바가 메바지 도신다 삽케게 캬바다 뉴르기 캬바 용고레 마도 돈다라 상요고바도 냠네 지바 상기 최제바 임바 지바 차고 제자 튀어바 제바데 배기심을 해제 도송을 제자 데 저게 퇴섬 곰숨세야데 단 두세 계심을 쉬우선 제자 제름시나 당보 계심 퇴바 망도 세스 당보 롭죠 데 퇴바 롭죠 하고 지어고래서 지내네 곰자고래서 송고래 지자도 롭죠지 곰자상으로 내가 마싱베는 곰자기네스는 곰자싱만 지자다 당보도시네 롭죠지 곰자상다 가르가르 공부디가 차상하지 하고 되는 공부래서 도시는 송고 이제 퇴삼 곰숨세 당보 퇴 다운 퇴비기 된델드는 안에야도 삼다 심주시 제바제 되네 심주시 된다다 하고 되는 곰자야 돼. 做 곰자 도시는 저거래서 지자다 된다 차상 지고 차고래 다디 두루라도 곰세데 되죠. 퇴선 곰세. 이제 다디 좋아. 다디 배 퇴바지 삼바시를 제홈으로 차고래. 진내다 내 곰세다디 퇴섬 곰숨세도 곰바세도 파지 제지 띵이지 곰바를 리고래.
Similar, another point to make here is that Lama Tsongkhapa encouraged people to engage in the three: hearing, reflecting, and meditating. So hearing or studying is indispensable because one needs to gather knowledge to understand our situation and what we can do about it. The deeper our education, the deeper our understanding will be. We will also have, by having more knowledge integrated with it, by having more knowledge, there is more to integrate through the process of reflection. And this is what all of you are engaged in, hearing teachings and then reflecting on the teachings. So reflection in this context will mean analytical meditation. So it's what we do in our rooms. And by understanding, the deeper we understand the Dharma, the more we have to integrate. If one just wants to hear the pith instructions, the essence of the teachings, one has very little to integrate within. But as one comes to gather a deeper knowledge, one will not engage in discussions about whether the Lamrim approach or that of the Shantideva's approach is better. One will recognize there's some difference in terms of sequence and emphasis, but other than that, there really isn't much in terms of difference. And through one's deeper education, one's qualities that one is developing deepen. I gave the illustration of refuge. The refuge of a practitioner of initial capacity is turning for protection to the three jewels, knowing that in that way they will gain protection from falling to the low realms. Here, one turns to the three jewels, knowing one gains protection from the sufferings of cyclic existence. So in other words, in the being of initial capacity, turn to the three jewels, knowing their guidance would lead to their temporary liberation from falling into the lower realms in their next life. Here, one turns to the three jewels, knowing that through their guidance, one will achieve complete liberation from suffering in its entirety. And there's a further depth to refuge as well, which comes with the practitioner of great scope. So as one develops one's education, all the qualities one is developing deepen and deepen and deepen. And when one is then ready to engage in the practices of Tantra, one will see, again, the presentation is quite different, but it comes down to developing the six perfections in order to abandon the afflictions. That's what it comes down to. So, to be able to do so, Lama Tsongkhapa strongly encouraged that we engage in this process of hearing and reflecting as the preliminary to meditation. So this term meditation in the context of hearing, reflecting, and meditating, it doesn't mean what we colloquially use meditation for. It means single-pointed concentration, or it means meditating with the union of calm abiding and meditative insight. So it really is the more yogic levels of meditation. Whereas reflecting is the kind of meditation that we do in our rooms. So these two, hearing and reflecting, are the preliminary to eventually be able to engage in a yogic meditation.
지난 저기 8진다 우마세야지. 지난 8진 세대 손도 8진 롭종 지기세대 롭종 제디데 진보 주준서버 주준 섬대 시랍 죽디데 디 고테셰 캡체다디 게 개발서 배 마자루도 8진데 디시고를 저도 디고를 냠는 제래. 지난다 우마슬라비오데 디나네 수 동반이 고 로서 된제 니고 미수까지 해야 될래요. 우마기야 거시고 우마세 동반이 고 동반이 또 셰럽 때문에 진보 주주서 전에 삼대 셰럽여와 셰럽다 아니 동반이 고 디고 또로지 수수로 된제 마 해야 될 우마고 시고래. 제가 발신 나위도 진보 주주서 전에 삼대 셰럽 차상도 고 시고 제가 발신 기야바래. 제가 진짜 냠nen제라 롭조제 발신 냠nen 롭조제스도 진보 주주서 전에 삼대 셰럽 두기고 롭조지고래. 우메 냠nen제도 조 진보 주주서바는 조 동반이고 동반이다 신이 디고 롭조지고래. 제가다 관절에 발신 냠nen 롭조지고요. 우마 롭조지고랍네. 제사데 줄 뒤져봐 진보 주주서 전에 삼대 셰럽 두기래. 죽시순거 뒤조시고래. 우마나라 조 동반이 디나 죽나네다 니도 동반이 조데 셰랍기고 시고래. 지난디 냠nen 롭조제사데 디마도 디레다 돈다 두시나.
When one studying the great texts, when one comes to study the ornament of clear realizations, one is studying there the 6 perfections. So it works a bit better in Tibetan, but so the name of the primary text that is studied is Ornament of Clear Realizations within the topic, but the topic is that of the perfections. So when I say studying the Ornament of Clear Realizations, it refers to a text, but the topic of the text is the perfections. So what one studies there are the 6 perfections in an expansive and detailed manner. It's studied for many years. Then when one comes to the next topic, the next great text, that is the presentation on the middle way, where one looks at the 6th perfection, that of the wisdom realizing emptiness, in particular depth. So in this way, over a number of years, one studies the 6 perfections in great detail, starting with the ornament of clear realizations. So the topic here in Tibetan is called Pachin, and Pachin is the word for perfection. So you could say 6 perfections is the word for Pachin, and then the word for 6. So you study first for many years the perfections in great detail, but all six of them with detail and breadth. Then one comes to the middle way teachings, and there one is studying emptiness in particular, the 6th perfection in great detail.
에단 파라미타 세파르텐로와 데 우마세네가레 마티아마가스로와 제자디 돈다롭존체 디레 로디톡티 디코시고레.
So many years are spent on the paramitas, so the Pachin or the ornament of clear realization. So in these perfections, then followed by detailed on the middle way, the 6th perfection.
Yeah, and in it. So then
we can conclude here for this morning, having looked at identifying the mind striving for liberation, and then we can continue from there this afternoon. If you have any questions, there's still a few minutes. Venerable Lama?
On one level, we need to be healthy and happy enough to do our practice, but on another way, to experience suffering deeply in order to have that revulsion for the psychic existence, how do we balance the two? Because somehow to get to that depth of revulsion is very difficult. We really want to be happy and the level of balance and happiness that we need. That's the question. Because I felt like when in Buddha's life he went through those austere practices to get to that real deep level of acknowledgement of suffering. So just do we wish on one level to have that experience of that deep suffering?
So can I say something about the balance that is required? On one hand, we need to be happy and healthy, but we also need to have a revulsion for samsara. And so can Geshe say about how to have a balance between these two, between a revulsion for samsara, but also generally living happily and healthily?
Then Kasure Danale Chayim City some Dana Sigarwa, the Chayim or some Dana said. Roa. Dinigi that's San Jumden Dambo Kawa Shuche Sharawa. Jisa San Jumden Digi Kawacha was some ye Sangi to some mares, Jisa Ludilia, Kangana, Dizami Sangi to some mares and did change in jelly Shala Churwa. Is the Dan of the Dondala Dirwa some no Busovotna Skayama, Dinisudi, Dinit in the Ray said, how go the how go bear Yahweh something sometimes, Nibuso Chamber, a Dinishan, Nisu the how gonna bear Yahweh, such as a D say Tablamio, said. Dirwa, some die depending on the Chigi, and Nisu Dinigi, some die. The Pusto or Chai Yungu, or this is near to sometimes how what bear what any delay tag tablam saying tablam years, delay yaga chag, and a tabla bear what is and be sometimes that he could come out sitting marwa.
So the illustration, the way Buddha Shakyamuni lived his life, the example that he gave was that neither extreme, the extreme of the greatest existence that one can imagine in our world, nor that of extreme austerities. Neither of these are the path to happiness. It is somewhere in between. So that was the reason for living the life he did, for showing that example. And to live this life in between requires the mind to understand our situation and that our situation can be changed. This leads to the mind being very positive. So when you look at the term, the mind striving for liberation, this is the mind that a practitioner will have. Why they're striving for liberation, they've given up on any hope for happiness in samsara, but they recognize something else is possible. So it is a very, very positive mind. It's a mind that knows something worthwhile can be achieved, and they are striving to do so. So it is a very positive mind. That is the mind that will be come to through looking at the fault of where we are and recognizing we can gain freedom from that. So it is a positive mind, not a negative mind. And then just to say, as an addition from the translator side, it's a problem with this word renunciation, because the renunciation in our common usage is always negative. You renounce pleasure, and that is not the meaning. We're renouncing suffering. So therefore, the mind that one is developing is this positive mind striving for liberation. And this will keep coming up. So the way to develop this positive outlook, we'll be looking at anyway from this afternoon and throughout this topic.